Hello, welcome to Cubs PS Plus, the Northside Numbers Game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. Cubs PS Plus is part of the Bleacher Bunch Productions on the Fans First Sports Network, joining great shows like The Sun Ranto Show, Cup of Cubby Blue, and Baseball Rabbit Hole. The Bleacher Bunch feed is available wherever it is you get your podcasts, and Cubs PS Plus is always available ad-free to Patreon supporters at patreon.com/CubsPSPlus, where you can support the show and find a variety of benefits for as little as $1 a month. In addition to the podcast feeds, you can also find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at Cubs PS Plus, a spin on the baseball metric OPS Plus. Love the pod or hate it? Please drop a review wherever it is you find your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you so much. Maybe you can share an episode with a friend. It's July 1, 2024. The Cubs are 39-46 in last place of the division, and there's a lot we need to talk about. Are you ready? I'm ready. Here. Welcome into episode 80. No Cub has ever worn the number 80, but two former Cubs have hit 80 career home runs. Delino DeShields Sr., who ended his career with the Cubs, hitting his last 5 homers with the team in 2001 and 2002, and Darren Jackson, who began his career with the Cubs in 1985 before being traded to San Diego in 1989. The Cubs sent Jackson, along with pitcher Calvin Schiraldi and pitcher Phil Stevenson, to the Padres for outfielder Marvell Wynn and infielder Luis Salazar, who both helped the Cubs win the NL East that year. Today, I'm hitting topics you guys want to talk about. I put out a call for a mailbag episode and got some great questions and topics, so let's get into it. To start, we'll talk about what this Cubs team is doing, which is nothing good right now. The Cubs just got through losing 2 out of 3 to Milwaukee, and the last game yesterday on Sunday was just dreadful. The Cubs got a solo home run from Nico Hoerner to lead off the game and a hit from Cody Bellinger as the third hitter in the game, and that was the extent of their offense for the day. They would get no more hits after that. They lose 7-1. They had kind of a disastrous fourth inning. Kind of disastrous is probably an understatement. But that inning kind of featured everything. Talked about, gave up a 2-run homer to Christian Yelich, and then got a couple little hits. There was some weak contact. There was a fly ball to left field that Ian Happ should have caught, but sort of misplayed when the wind caught the ball and it moved more than he was expecting it to, and it fell in for one of the longest singles you'll ever see. And then it ended with a grand slam. Bryce Turang hit a grand slam off Kyle Hendricks, and it was just kind of an example of everything we've seen this season. The Cubs didn't score enough. The Cubs pitching got into some spots. Kyle Hendricks couldn't get out of the problem. And here the Cubs are. They're 7 games under 500, and they are actually closer to Milwaukee in the they're actually closer to the Colorado Rockies in the standings right now than they are Milwaukee. They're 10 games ahead of Colorado, and they're 11 and a half games ahead of Milwaukee, or 11 and a half games behind Milwaukee. For the record, I'm recording this before any games have played today, so whatever happens tonight may change all or some of that. I'm not even sure which teams play. But to get into it, how did the Cubs get to where they were? I started this season. Last time we had a mailbag episode, it was a lot of stuff about me projecting the standings. How did I think the Cubs were going to do this year? What prospects did we see might emerge? And this time the questions were, again, similarly time appropriate. I mean, it's all about how the season's going, but it's a lot of, what do I think of some of the young players that have played this year? What do I think of some of the guys who are struggling? What do I think about buying versus selling at the deadline? And we'll get into all that. But to first set the stage, I'll take it back to what I said before the season started. I thought this team was like an 89-90 win team with potential for more if they were able to get hot, if the division was a little weaker than expected, or if the Cubs added to the deadline. I really thought the floor for this team was really probably, low 80s in terms of wins. I thought we'd kind of see what we saw last year as kind of the floor of this team, and that the team should have been better. I still think on paper this team is better than last year's team. And really, to an extent, it's gone a little bit differently. The Cubs had an okay April last year, a terrible May, came back with a much better June. And this year now they're actually trending a little bit behind where they were last year. But they had, a really good April. And then May was a disaster. June continued the disaster. And so here we are. The Cubs have not shown yet one of those stretches like they showed in the early middle part of June last year. This showed that the Cubs could win, I forget what the streak was, 7-8 games in a row, 8 out of 10, something like that. And they would wind up having a couple of those, one of them leading directly into the deadline. And this year's team has not done that. I mean, this team has not yet been swept in a series, which I guess is it is a good thing, but it doesn't really mean much so far for this team. They were about the end of May, I think, possibly early June, when they had their first 3-game losing streak. So this team avoided the long losing streak, which at the time I thought was a very good thing. Excuse me. This team had a ton of injuries to start the year. A lot of relief pitchers down, injuries to, Ian Happ started the season, Gimpy on a hamstring. Jamison Tyone missed most of the first month. Julian Merriweather went down quickly. It seemed like it was guy after guy after guy. And for a while, with the April the team put together when the team was actually scoring quite a few runs and the starting pitching was good, but, Adbert Alzolay and some of the guys at the back end of the bullpen were losing games. It was good to see them kind of keep their head above water. Even getting into May, when the May started to be not so great, they were still getting, they were not getting swept in a series. They were often finding a way to win a series and just kind of, maybe win every other series. Now they've only won one 3-game or longer series since May 12th. So that clearly fell off. They haven't won a road series since May 12th. They were keeping their head above water with all the injuries, and that was very helpful. It seemed like this team would get Dansby Swanson was down, Nico Horner was down, Seiya Suzuki was out for a while, Cody Bellinger was out for a while, that they'd keep their head above water. Those guys would come back, begin performing to the norms that they typically perform at, and then this team could get back in the race. They really have only been out of the race lately, and even now they're within range of getting back into it. So it's been really frustrating. On the whole, the offense started the season really well and then has been pretty much a disaster since the start of May. The rotation has been largely consistent most of the season. Early in the year, they were not getting quite enough length from Jordan Wicks, Javier Assad. Obviously, Tyone was down. Shota Imanaga had a key start against the Dodgers that was shortened by a rain delay. So all of that kind of stacked up pressure on the bullpen. And the bullpen itself has been mostly bad. The back end of the bullpen has been particularly atrocious. I think they're roughly 50-50 on save chances this year, or blown saves compared to saves, which is not exactly the same. Sometimes the blown save comes in the 7th or the 8th, and the Cubs don't get the lead back. But the challenge with this team is, where are we going to go from here? So we saw a lot this weekend. We saw the completely dead game on Sunday. On Saturday, we saw, what looked like it was going to be a really good pitcher's duel, and actually turned out to be. Justin Steele was on the hill for the Cubs. There was an inning in the 4th where they botched a rundown. Justin Steele got a ground ball, I'm pretty sure it was Sal Frelick, caught off second base, ran at him, probably didn't run at him quite far enough, but threw to Nico Horner, who then was running him towards third base. And what you really want to do in that situation is you want to go dead sprint for a few steps and then get the ball to third base. So that at worst, the worst case scenario is, Frelick's going to try to stay alive until the batter can get to second, and which I think was Monasterio. And at worst, you want to run him back to second base where you can tag both guys and one of them is going to be out. But that's not what happened in this case. In this case, Horner did not go hard enough at Frelick towards third base. And, I've seen some references to Christopher Morel should have been on the bag. No, in a rundown, you want to tighten it up and shorten the area so you can get him with 1 or 2 throws. But Nico Horner waited too long to throw the ball. And so by the time the ball got to Morel, Frelick was already basically even with him going past, and Morel was not able to get the tag on. It also kind of looked like Morel dropped the ball, but that was really in the transition to his throwing hand. So that was botched. And then there was a bunt attempt that, Steele couldn't pick up, runner safe. There was that was on a squeeze. So, a run scored. Everybody's frustrated. There was a ball hit to center field, and we'll talk more about PCA later, but Pico Armstrong came flying in. I think he could have made what would have been a really, really good catch. But Dansby and Nico, who were playing in because runner at third base, were going out for the ball. And I think there's a lot right now. There's a transition period where I think Ian Happ, Bellinger, or Seiya in right field, and then the 2 middle infielders sort of have to recalibrate how far they expect their center fielder to go. Because I think PCA could have gotten to this ball, except that he kind of had to avoid Nico at the last second, who was still charging out for it. And I love that Dansby and Nico can cover ground and get to some of those pop-ups. But I think there's basically a big bubble where I think the Cubs need to just let PCA operate. He's going to get to a lot of things. And I don't know what that ultimately would have changed that inning. There was already frustration. The Cubs did go on to win the game 5-3 late on an Ian Happ home run. But coming back in after that inning, there was a big outburst by Justin Steele. Wake the F up. Wake the F up as he's going in the dugout, screaming at teammates. And I'm kind of a mixed bag on that. It's not a great look. I like that there's emotion being shown. If it was an inning maybe where Justin Steele didn't make any mistakes, maybe it would come off a little bit better. I saw it praised by a lot of people as a big leadership moment or, a really shining example of what a leader on the team should do. Not sure I'm all the way there. But the way this team has been going, and we'll talk more about some roster construction later, but the Cubs are built with a lot of level head, kind of even keel kind of guys. Over the course of 162, I actually think that's really a good thing. But a lot of times you want to have those one or two players that are going to carry a little bit more intensity, that are going to be a little bit more likely to get in a guy's face or say something. And, if that's Steele, that's great. And even in that moment, if he felt it and needed to get that out, go for it. Like I don't hate it. I'm just not sure I'm ready to laud it as like a big, great example. It's not the best example to kids, but you know what? Neither was that defense either. So that kind of takes me into the first question I got from Melvin Widman on Twitter, at Melvin Widman. He wanted to know my take kind of in comparison. It was after that game where he raised the question. Earlier in the week, Dansby Swanson had been asked about how they've been playing lately and what he thought that meant going forward. And part of Dansby Swanson's answer was that it's only June. And so Melvin wanted to know what I thought about that since they've been playing poorly since early May. Like, what does that mean? Is that a bad mentality to have? And I think I can see this two ways. I think it's a good question. There's been a lot of banter about it, especially since Steele's outburst and then that game on Sunday. It just, fans watch the game, and when the team's losing, it's great when you win, right? I mean, the game goes early, everybody's smiling, high-fiving, things are going well. Maybe you get a walk-off or a late win and everybody's excited about it. Those are great vibes, and that really helps feed fans. On the flip side, when you're losing, there's none of that. Like, nobody's really celebrating on the field. There's nothing really good to talk about. Maybe you have a negative outburst or two. And so on the one hand, from a player's perspective, they have to take this as 162. If you play like every single game is Game 7 of the World Series from late March, early May, or early April, whenever you start, all the way through whenever your season ends, you're gonna fry mentally. I mean, so it's good to have that even keel. It's good to not freak out. I've talked a lot in this podcast about when the Cubs should start making moves when things aren't working. There's a point where on one absurd end, just because a guy starts with 2 0-for-4s on the first 2 games of the season doesn't mean he's going to have a terrible year. It doesn't. On the flip side, if we also went through Tuffy Rhodes. If Tuffy Rhodes hits 3 homers on opening day, it doesn't mean he's all of a sudden Babe Ruth. So there's a balance between finding the sample size and having a sense of urgency and all that. And so Dansby's right when he says it's only June. The Cubs are not hopelessly out of the playoff race. They're certainly trending in a terrible direction, and they may be getting to the point where they're going to have a hard time getting back in the race, given the number of teams they're trailing in both the division and the wild card. Certainly that's not what fans really want to hear. I mean, the fans are invested. Now, the fans can have some anticipation to the game, and a lot of what I see are people that spend a lot of time on social media. So you're very into it. You're very wrapped up in it. And then you watch the game, and then you're pissed, and then you can go do your thing. These guys have some of that same energy. Like they get a couple hours of game prep, and then they have the game, and they're unhappy afterwards, and they got to unwind, and they got to do whatever. And then they have to come back and do it again the next day. But they also have to travel. They've got family to bring into and all that stuff. So I don't mind the fact that, a player has that mentality. It does come off when they're playing like this, like they're kind of back on their heels, like they don't care. These guys do care. These guys are professional athletes who've been doing it for a really long time. Most of these guys have been playing this game their entire life and invested just about everything they've ever done into getting to the major leagues and staying there. So while it's easy to say Dansby got paid, now he doesn't care, he cares. I could also argue that some of these guys maybe care too much. Michael Cotton and I last week talked about the use of the iPads and how much time the Cubs spend looking at them and kind of analyzing things in game. I think there's definitely an element to when a season's going like this, guys press, guys probably do put a little, actually too much, even though we don't necessarily see it or feel it watching the game on TV. I think a lot of these guys are putting a little bit too much on each at bat, trying to be a little bit too perfect. I see that with all the strikeouts looking they've had lately. I think guys are starting to try to guess on pitches, try to look for that pitch they know they can do damage on, when sometimes, even if you're technically maybe right that a ball was a little bit off the plate. I mean, Michael Cotton and I disagree generally about the use of the K-zone. I like it. He doesn't. But he's definitely right in his perspective that, like, you can't just look at a bunch of Ks where you strike out looking and go back and look at the video and say, hey, I was right, no problem. We teach this stuff at 8 years old when kids are coming up playing baseball. Like, with 2 strikes, you got to get the bat out there. You got to protect. And it's okay. I mean, sometimes you're going to, even as a coach, I tell kids to protect, to anticipate what the umpire is going to do, to pay attention if the ump has a zone that's 3 inches off the outside corner. You have to adjust to that. We don't have the robo umps. We don't have the K-zone challenge at this point, the ABS challenge. So players do have to adjust. They do have to. Otherwise, they're just going to take those Ks. And too many of those are coming in big spots. And so I know it looks like they're not trying. I think in some cases they're actually pressing too hard and really just need to relax and play ball. And maybe for some of them, maybe that means actually stepping back from some of the analytics. But I like that question. There's not really a right way to do it. I think whatever the attitude is, though, each player has to have an attitude that is natural for them, that allows them to function and continue to work on their game without grinding themselves down mentally. And as a team, there have to be leaders. I'm sure this team has leaders. There's not sort of that big, obvious vocal leader. There's not the 2016 team had, especially, John Lester. John Lackey was a very vocal guy. They had, David Ross was a big leader on that team, Miguel Montero. Anthony Rizzo in a more laid-back sort of way. So Dexter Fowler, again, more of a laid-back kind of leader. And it's good to have those different styles because some guys sometimes need to have somebody else get in their face. But then you also can't be dialing it up to 11 every day. So let's move on to some of the young players. So one of the questions I got from Alex on Twitter, will Christopher Morel ever start regressing to the mean and live up to his expected stats? And so he's an interesting one to watch. I've talked about him a lot in my last 2 episodes. He's a guy who his expected stats say he should be crushing. I mean, he is crushing baseballs. His average should be a lot higher. His slug should be a lot higher. He should be a much more effective offensive player. And I think it's worth noting one thing. There's sort of some pros and cons here. So one of the things I really like about Christopher Morel is if you look at his first 2 partial seasons in the majors in 2022 and 2023, he was pretty consistent on about 31, 32% strikeout rate and about a 8.5 to 9% walk rate. And so he's taken that this year and he's bumped that walk rate up to almost 12%. He's at 11.9 today. And his K rate is down to 22%. So even though it feels like his Ks have been trending up lately, he's at a point where this reduction, so going from 31% to 22%, which is a reduction of about a third, 10%. It's weird when you're talking about reducing statistics, but going from 31 to 22% for a hitter his age that had his reputation for swinging wildly and having a lot of chase is really impressive. And that's a really good sign going forward. So do I think he will? Yeah, I still believe in this bat. On the flip side, he's at 345 plate appearances. So we're not talking about if we were having this discussion in April and he's hitting a $190 and he's got 60 plate appearances, let this play out. But one thing that there is some concern about is, the bigger sample size, he's not getting results. We're still seeing the power, but we're kind of seeing boom and bust kind of power. I think he's still on pace for, 20 plus home runs. probably pushing 30. He leads the team in RBIs, but that may be more a function of the team as a whole as opposed to him really killing it with RBIs. But I'm not seeing a lot of change in his approach. So he's kind of given the same swing regardless of where he is in the at-bat. Now he has changed. He's been more willing to take pitches, which is good. It's led to maybe a few too many strikeouts looking for my benefit. And he doesn't swing with 2 strikes with quite as much authority as he has in the past. But he is still tending to hit the ball in the same couple areas. So one of the ways in which expected stats don't eventually pay off, is if you're just doing enough of the same thing over and over again that the defense is really able to position on you. And the more he spreads that out, when he's had good stretches this season, he's gone more center field to right center approach. The more he does that, it widens the area where his batted balls go. And he does continue to hit the ball hard. He's got, one of the better exit velocities averages in the league. He's got a very good barrel rate. So if you're hitting the ball hard, the defense doesn't have a lot of time to react. So if you're standing where the ball goes, that doesn't matter because the ball just finds your glove. But if you're broadening that out and they can't position you quite as tightly and you're spraying the ball just a little bit more, that's where his hard hit ball rate is going to pay off. So I am a big believer in his bat. I think the changes he's made are very impressive for his age and bode well going forward. I think he's going to continue to work on his offensive game. But I think to hit that next step to really start seeing some of this pay off is he's going to have to change that approach a little bit. And another thing that tends to get him is he hits a lot of fly balls that don't quite go out. And that's because, he's just under them. So he's catching too much elevation. He's elevating them too much, which can be either timing or it can be the pitch he's choosing. Like trying to elevate a high fastball, it's really hard to get your hands up that high. That's something really you have to get your hands up and just go with the line drive. But so as he starts to adjust and continues to work, I think it's going to come through. But, will it come through this season? I don't know. There have been a lot of very good baseball players that have a bad year, or there have been a lot of young players that show promising signs and eventually figure it out. But at this point, with 345 plate appearances, there's certainly no guarantees that Christopher Morel is going to hit the numbers we expect him to hit this year. So it's not the best answer, but will he ever? I do think he will. I think he's a guy who will hit in his career. I think he's going to be in the league for a while. I think he's definitely a guy who will get to a second contract or get to free agency and get that contract. We'll see. If doesn't necessarily mean he'll be a star, but it means he'll be in the league for 5-6 years plus. And that's a good baseball player. And he's only going to do that by hitting. While he's shown some improvements defensively, he's not a guy who's going to win games with his glove. Another guy I want to talk about is Michael Busch. I don't have a specific question about him, but there were some young guys the Cubs were looking to have emerge this year, and Busch is one they made a key trade for. They traded Jackson Ferris, a highly thought of pitching prospect who, if he's not in the top 100, will be soon, now with the Dodgers, and Zaire Hope, who the Cubs drafted late in last year's draft and gave him a big overslot so that he wouldn't go to North Carolina and play baseball. They gave up some real prospect capital for Michael Busch, and they really believe in him, and I think we're seeing why. He got off to a quick start, had a lot of power. Then, as it does, the league adjusts to you, and he really slumped for a while. He still kept the walk numbers up, got enough hits, but he's got one of the better batting averages on the team right now. He's got the best, with Mike Tauchman out, he's got the best OPS on the team. He's really starting to turn into a good hitter. He's still got the K rate's still a little too high, higher than I'd like to see. He's up over 35%, 36%. But if he can maintain that walk rate, you can live with that. And especially if he can, he may not make the huge leap that Christopher Morel made and drop that to the low 20s. But if he can drop that to 30 or a tick below while maintaining the walk rate and hitting the ball hard, that's going to be a really, really good thing for him. So that takes me to the next one. Brian Crow on Twitter, @BlueWaveBrian, had a question. Thanks for your thoughts on this one. He said I would love to know your thoughts on PCA's offense at the big league level, future with the club, and at what point does he become a trade piece at all? And a couple things I want to talk about here are, so I'm going to talk about him primarily as a hitter, but everything I say about him as a hitter has to be kept with the perspective that his glove is absolutely elite, as is his speed. So he's going to bring you a lot of defensive value at one of the most premium positions in center field. It's either that or shortstop. I forget which one is actually rated higher. He's going to bring you elite defense, and he's going to bring you elite speed, and that raises his floor a long, long way. So a couple guys I'm going to make comparisons to are Kevin Kiermaier and Michael A. Taylor. Now, both of those guys are higher than what PCA's absolute floor would be. The floor would be he never really hits anything more than he's doing right now. He's getting on base at a low clip, and he's, not hitting for power. He's not hitting for average. So let's take high end. And when I talk floor ceiling, I mean, let's say ceiling. Let's say PCA does basically eventually gets to a point where he's repeating what he did in the minors and the majors. And so when I look at his time, his best season was, he killed it in A-ball, AA. So take his AAA numbers. Last year he had a 106 WRC plus, hit 271, got on base at a 350 clip, had a 479 slug. Don't know that he'll get that high, but he had, 20 home runs last year. He had 16 in 2022. So he's a guy that has some power. I could see him as he gets a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger. I could see him at peak, like a ceiling, being like a 20-25 home run guy who's going to get on base at, 35-36%, run like crazy, and have a slug probably, 450 to 475 maybe would be a good high-end projection for him. Because he's going to take a lot of, just with his wheels, he's going to take a lot of singles, stretch them into doubles to triples. So he's going to, even if he doesn't hit a huge amount of homers, he's a guy who, if he's hitting the ball well, could very well rack up a lot of doubles and triples. But if we talk about kind of perceived floor, so he's elite offensively. Let's look at Michael A. Taylor. Michael A. Taylor has had one season in his career where he was above average major league hitter by WRC plus. That was 2017. He had a 104. Most of his career, he's been, his second best season actually was last year at 96. He's had an 89, a bunch of seasons in the 70s. And if you look at his overall player value, in 2017 with that 104, he was actually a 3-win player, but he had a very good glove and the good offense. If you look at a season like 2021 when he was with the Royals, he only put up a 75 WRC plus. So that means he was 25% worse offensively than the average player in baseball. But he put up enough defensive strength and speed strength that his overall WAR was 2.2. So he was almost a 2.5 win player on a 75 WRC plus. The next year, 2022, he had an 89 WRC plus and was worth 1.8 Fangraphs WAR. And last year, he was put up to 96 and was worth 2 Fangraphs WAR. So that's kind of what we're looking at for PCA. I mean, he's going to have to hit, as long as he can stay in the lineup and the team is made up in a way that they can continue to have him in the lineup. He's the kind of guy who's going to put up a lot of defensive value and not necessarily have to hit a ton. Obviously, if he does, then he'll become a very, very good player. We look at it this year so far in limited play. So he's only played in 51 games, 144 plate appearances. PCA's got a 28% strikeout rate, 4.2% walk rate. He's hitting 192. He's slashing 192, 243, 277. He's got a 48 WRC plus. He's like 52% worse than the average major league hitter, but he's put up half a WAR. So half a win off that offensive profile kind of gives you some idea. It's not exactly projectable, but say he does that over the, take it times 3, because he's going to play a lot more in the second half. So say he's played like a third of the amount of time he's going to play this season. He might get to 1.5 WAR and not be much over 50, 60 WRC plus. That's the kind of value he can give you. Now the question is, so really to Alex's question, or to Brian's question, what does that mean for the team? Well, it kind of depends on how you build the team. If you decide, I've got my elite glove in center field, he's super fast, when he gets on base, he's going to create chaos, you might just go for it and let it go. And so there you project the value. At that point, if he's worth a couple wins a season and you're getting elite D and good speed, maybe that's enough. But to support that offensive profile in center field, it means you've got to make up for it other places. That's one of the issues with this team right now is they're not getting much out of Dansby at shortstop. They're getting a little bit more average from Cody Bellinger, but they're getting like no slug. He's not driving baseballs. You're not getting the kind of production you were expecting to get. Nico Horner, until very recently, has been below his typical projection. So the Cubs have been putting PCA out there, struggling offensively, in a lineup that has a bunch of guys struggling offensively. We just talked about Christopher Morel. If all of a sudden you've got, they make an upgrade in the offseason, they've got a big bat. Let's say they sign Juan Soto or whatever. They get a big bat in the middle of the lineup, and some of the guys get back to more their career norms. Dansby's going to do his thing and have a 770 OPS with 25 home runs. All of a sudden you get enough of that around the diamond, and PCA in center field hitting at that level is no problem. So, at this point, the Cubs really have two choices, and I'll focus this on both deadline and this next offseason. The only way you would trade a PCA at this deadline, and I know that's not the intent of your question, so I'm not trying to go there, but I'm talking it through, is if you're going to go get another big piece. I've seen some talk about Cubs trading for Luis Robert from the White Sox. If the Cubs do that, Luis Robert's going to be your center fielder for the next, for the rest of this contract, and you're probably going to try to extend him. So at that point, PCA probably goes in that trade. Now, I don't think that trade's going to happen, but that's a scenario where PCA would get traded. In this offseason, PCA is a top 20 prospect in baseball right now until probably by the end of the season, he'll no longer be a prospect. So he'll probably graduate from that status. But a young player with his profile, he's only 22. He's got a lot of room to grow, a lot of time to grow. And if they trade him this offseason, again, it would likely be in a trade for a bigger piece. So to help get you that elite bat that you're missing in the lineup. Otherwise, I don't see any real reason to trade PCA. He's not hitting right now, so he's certainly not at max offensive value. We saw him come up and struggle late last year in a very limited sample size. He's having his offensive struggles now, but we've also seen that glove. And that glove is going to deliver value game after game after game after game. So at what point does he become a trade piece? I think it's either, in the next 18 months, not 18 months, maybe like the next 12 months, 12, 13 months, as a piece you're trying to use to get a bigger bat. Or eventually, I don't know, like if he never hits, if that bat never comes around and he just is consistently hitting 200 and playing great defense, maybe you're not starting him every day. Maybe he becomes a platoon guy and a defensive replacement. Well, then you reduce his value. So I'm not really sure at this point that PCA would become a trade piece unless the Cubs do it soon. Hopefully he'll just hit and become a star, and that would be ideal. So I also want to talk about young relievers. So Pete on Twitter at baseplayer_2K, one of his questions was, why didn't the Cubs develop more young relievers? And that's something the Cubs have clearly been working on and not having a ton of success with yet. We see teams like the Astros, Rays, some of these teams just pumping out, especially you get late in the season in the playoff chase. They just start bringing up guys, and it's a guy who throws 98 out of the pen, another guy who throws heat, another guy with a wicked slider. It's guy after guy after guy that can go up there and strike hitters out and eat innings. So part of it, it's kind of a two-tier question. One, the Cubs really significantly changed their scouting and draft infrastructure in 2020, 2021. So certainly 2019 and prior, the Cubs had not done a very good job drafting pitchers at all. So that changed. But as you start to do that, those pitchers start, in the complex league in A-ball and have to work up through AA and AAA. So that infrastructure being about 2.5 to 3 years in place is just now starting to feed those guys up to the major leagues. So I think it's not that they didn't or they chose not to or something like that. I think it's just a process, and the Cubs haven't gotten there yet. They had a couple early ones. Manny Rodriguez came up in the 2022, end of 2021, end of 2022, was throwing gas, 99. Had trouble locating it, putting a lot of those fastballs middle, and even if you're throwing 99 or 100, middle is going to get pounded. Jeremiah Estrada showed some signs, but again, like another guy with an elite fastball, but just didn't have enough else to go with it, and was not locating enough secondary stuff to really play off that fastball. And so the Cubs they traded Manny Rodriguez. They had just cut Jeremiah Estrada, who signed with the Padres, or maybe he was a DFA trade. I can't remember specifically, but they DFA'd him first. And Estrada now has come around. Like, they've worked with him. They found another pitch. He's much better on command and location. So he's a sign that the Cubs are seeing some of the guys. Like, the talent in Jeremiah Estrada was always there. They just hadn't unlocked it. They got into a roster bind. So you look at the current team, there are a number of guys that I think fall in that bucket. So currently on the Major League active roster, we have Luke Little, Porter Hodge, and Ethan Roberts. I mean, Luke Little throws hard. He comes in from a nasty angle on lefties, being a left-hander. He has a really high ground ball rate, which is great. The thing he struggled with is command. You know, he's come in, he's walked too many guys. He's gotten burned a couple times, leaving things middle. But he's a guy lately who's looking a lot better, and he's a guy who I do think is going to figure it out. I mean, his stuff is there. His delivery looks effortless. Stuff pops. You can tell guys aren't comfortable in the box. Porter Hodge is another guy on the right-hand side. You know, got a really good pitch mix, can bring some gas. Again, he's up for the first time. This is the first year he's even on the 40-man roster, and he's just got limited time in the bigs so far. But he's showing that hard stuff. I mean, last couple times out, he's looked like he has closer potential. And so he just needs more consistency and consistently locate, not fall behind. When he falls behind and has to come back and they're sitting on his fastball, it's hittable like any fastball is. Also talk about Ethan Roberts. He came back, pitched Sunday for the first time in the bigs since early 2022 when he tore his UCL and had to have Tommy John surgery. So exciting to see that kid back. Like, he had a really great spring training in 2022. The Cubs were high on him, former 4th round draft pick, and his stuff moves a lot. We saw it last night. I'm not going to judge him on one inning of mop-up duty in a 7-1 loss in his first action back since 2022, where I'm sure he had the adrenaline firing big time. But you could see that movement. His movement was good. It was actually a little bit too much. He did walk 2 guys, gave up a hit, but threw a scoreless inning and got a couple strikeouts. So I'm excited to see what he can do. And then, there are guys on the injured list right now. So Adbert Alzolay is a guy who came up with the Cubs as a starter, but always looked like a guy that could have a future in the bullpen. He was really good last year. He was good in flashes before, on and off the injured list. Excuse me. And he didn't have it this year. I also don't know if he was really ever healthy this year. Maybe we'll find out eventually. He didn't really look himself. He was not locating his pitch as well. In any case, it looks like he's down for a while. It looks maybe there's a chance he could come back in August or September, but I think at this point it's looking more and more likely like he'll be out for the season. There's Ben Brown, who the Cubs got from the Phillies in the David Robertson trade in 2022. He's looked really good. Now he's coming back from injury. He is throwing. He's thrown some bullpens. I don't think he's hasn't done any rehab yet, but I think he's trending positively. Hopefully he can be back in the next couple of weeks. And then Caleb Killian, who was becoming a bit of an afterthought. He came over in the Chris Bryant trade with the Giants in 21. And he was a starter prospect, had some just electric stretches in the minor leagues in the Arizona Fall League. Starting to project more and more as a reliever. Well, he looked amazing in spring training. I mean, he was pumping 99, showed great movement, good secondary stuff, kind of just going out there and dominating hitters. He got hurt. He's thrown multiple bullpens. He was going to throw, I think maybe today, sometime soon, he was going to throw a simulated game, or maybe he just did that over the weekend. So he's trending back. He's a guy I would love to get that velo back in the bullpen. He's exactly when you talk about bringing up young guys coming in pumping gas, what we saw from Caleb Killian in spring training is what that question's asking about. So I really hope that he can come back and be that guy. And then also currently in the minors, they have a couple guys who are on the 40 and are just in the minors. So Daniel Palencia, who has been up, and he showed some things up here. It's very similar to Manny Rodriguez and Jeremiah Estrada, Luke Little, Porter Hodge. Like, he throws hard. He's got the stuff. He's just got to command it. After being sent down, he also had an injured list stint, so he just recently got activated. He's thrown 2 scoreless innings in Iowa. I think in those 2 innings, he's given up 1 hit, 2 walks, struck out 4, I think. So we'll see how he trends back. If he can be healthy, his stuff really is electric. And then Michael Arias, who's doing some good things at Iowa. He's on the 40, has not been brought up to the majors yet, but he's another option that could come up later this season if he's going well or they continue to have injuries and need bodies. So, Pete, I mean, it's coming. I think there are even more guys behind them that I think project pretty highly as relievers. I think this is just one of those things where it just takes time. I mean, they should have been doing it all along, but when they changed their infrastructure and all that, like, I think we're now seeing the benefits of it. There is a large number of guys. I think maybe, had he not hurt his elbow, Ethan Roberts maybe would already be one of those guys. Sort of from the same bucket, Scott Efros. He was a Cub that they developed into a good reliever, wound up trading him for Hayden Wesneski. He's another guy. I didn't include him in this list because he's actually in the rotation right now, but like Ben Brown, he can be in the bullpen. His issue is, especially lately, just been giving up too many home runs. So I think he actually right now translates better as a starting pitcher because that one or two bad pitches doesn't necessarily hit you as much when you're a starting pitcher and you've got more innings to work with. But we'll see how he trends out. I know some guys are getting the B and not very high on him at all. I still like his stuff. He shows flashes, hasn't put it together. So now with all those young players and things we're talking about, like, what now, right? So what do the Cubs do? And this is going to take me into a little bit of roster construction theory and then prospects and what to do with the trade deadline. Patreon supporter David Elliott had a good question. He said, this is probably too large a question to ponder, but when you're trying to build a roster, how do you compare trying to become a dynasty versus trying to capture lightning in a bottle with a team that just gets hot and manages a run? And he cited the 2019 Nationals, which were bookended by sub 500 seasons. I think the Nats are a decent example of that, but they had actually been building for years. I mean, the Cubs famously knocked them out of the playoffs in that wild Max Scherzer game in 2017, kept them from going to the NLCS. They had, Strasburg up and down with injuries. They had the fights in the dugout between Bryce Harper and Jonathan Papelbon. So I think they were trying to become that sustained winner. Didn't get there, and then it did. It all fell apart after the 2019 season. COVID came, they cut salary, and it's just been a mess ever since. And actually similar to the Cubs, when they came up short prior to 2019, a lot of times it was because of the bullpen. So some of the same things the Cubs are seeing now. I think some other good examples are, the Marlins in the past have just outright bought 2 World Series. And another example is like San Francisco, what they've been doing the last couple of years. I know that they've tried to get some bigger free agents, but that 2022 San Francisco team that won 107 games, total lightning in a bottle season. It's just like, let's get a bunch of best guys we can find from the middle of the market and hope they all hit, and they all hit. And they've done that the last couple of years as well, and it hasn't hit quite as well. So for me, what I look for is, I think ideal construction is something Jed is clearly trying to do. The question is, can Jed ever pull it off? I think you want to build up a strong farm system, which he has, I think, unquestionably done over the last few years. You want to have a strong farm system that is pushing major league level talent to the big leagues. And from that talent, you want to be able to fill anywhere from 3 to 5 positions in the batting order. 1 to 3, ideally 2 or 3 starters, and probably a good half your bullpen out of that young talent. That allows you to have a bunch of guys who are young and cost controlled, probably still have some lift and some rise in their game with improvement over time. And what that does is that frees up a bunch of money then, where instead of having to do what the Cubs did, or Cubs felt like they had to do heading into the 2023 season, where they feel like they have to fill 5 holes, we're not going to go spend and get a star anywhere, but we're going to get Eric Hosmer and Mancini. We're going to go ahead and add Tucker Barnhart behind the plate. We're going to go add, Jamison Tyone has been a good pitcher, but they could have theoretically gone higher in the market. But they just had to go and add enough pieces that they went high on Dansby Swanson. He was the big one, and then Tyone was the second big one. But they didn't go top end after some of the stars. Well, the more you have, let's jump ahead a year. Let's say they don't necessarily trade guys, but let's say Christopher Morel emerges, and he's a legit power bat. He's pre-arb, he's cheap. Ian Happ is already locked under contract. Say is locked under contract. Michael Busch is pre-arb. Nico Horner is locked in at basically arb prices, a little bit higher than arb prices. If you start filling up that roster in the starting rotation, the Cubs could theoretically, if guys are healthy, have Jordan Wicks, Javier Assad, Ben Brown, Hayden Wesneski, Kate Horton, any combo of those guys making up, 2 to 3 spots in that rotation, plus Justin Steele, who's still cost controlled, that frees up a lot of money that other teams might have to spend on free agent starting pitchers that you can go put in somewhere else. And if you only have a limited number of spots that are open, you can make some trades and kind of refluctuate your roster to open up a spot where you can really get a guy. But then that allows you to go big. And we'll talk about I'm not going to get into what the Cubs spend today. They spend enough to win. They don't spend as much as they should. Cubs are basically right at the CBT right now. That's enough to not be in last place in the division. It just is. You should be able to win for $233 million. But what happens is if you're not carrying a bunch of guys on dead money because you shot the low end of the free agent pool and had to dump guys, if you are filling that roster with young players, that allows you to maybe have that, maybe we don't like that they're at the CBT, but maybe that's going to be their target. Well, you can still leave yourself room in there for a $35 or $40 million a year player. You just have to be better everywhere else. And I think that's very clearly what Jed is going for. Ideally, that's what I would like to see. It just, right now it's not working out. I think what's happened is he's done a good job of building up the farm system, and then he's played it too timidly in the free agent market and has not done enough. So you get enough guys that aren't good enough that you're now blocking spots. So over the last couple of years, we haven't seen enough of Matt Mervis to really know who he is. Christopher Morel, Nelson Velasquez, Alexander Canario, PCA have not gotten as much time as maybe you would ideally want them to get. Now, they did commit this season to making sure Michael Busch was going to play most of the time and Christopher Morel was going to play virtually every day. They believed in those bats and they really wanted to see them in action, which is good. But we still see, Alex Canario has been up and he's at the end of that bench that never plays. We've seen Vasquez come up at a really weird time and never play. So how are they going to do this to really give that young talent a chance to become a more major part of the organization? Then you're carrying a couple cheap vets, mid-tier, maybe veteran leadership guys as your bench. So you look at, 2016 maybe was a bit lucky in terms of how many prospects hit, but you had, Anthony Rizzo signed a very team-friendly extension when he was a younger player. In 2016, you had Chris Bryant pre-arb, Javi was pre-arb, Addison Russell was pre-arb, Kyle Schwarber was pre-arb. They've had so many of those guys that were pre-arbitration. I think Kyle had not yet signed his extension yet and was either pre-arb or early arb. And Jake Arrieta was in arbitration years. Like, that freed up money to go get John Lester, to bring Dexter Fowler back for a year, to go get John Lackey, to eventually go sign Yu Darvish. And while they didn't spend it well or wisely, they spent a lot of money on pitching that season with Yu Darvish and Brandon Morrow from the Dodgers, and the guy I'm blanking on from Tyler Chatwood from the Rockies. It lets you go take some of those big swing spots or bring back Cole Hamels on that $20 million option in 2019. It lets you take those shots if you've got enough cost-controlled stuff somewhere else. So that's that's who I think the Cubs are trying to be. That's what I think they should be. Then I just think they should spend higher and get a higher caliber star and hopefully develop one or two of their own. Thanks for that question. So these next couple are very much tied together. So we've got from St. Louis Hawk, from the Go Iowa Awesome Cubs discussion on the off-topic page. Do we kill it with fire or nuke everything? Well, that's a good question, but no, it's a serious question. Given the disaster in the pen and the lack of any serious movement, has the Cubs management given up on this year and will be sellers? And then Alex again from Twitter, do I think Jed should wait to buy or sell in the final 2 weeks of July like he did last year? So I'm going to talk about these two separately and then talk about the trade deadline in general more together. So on the serious question side, I think the Cubs have shown that they'll make moves. They've gone to Colton Brewer and Lovelady out of their system. They were brought in as veterans on minor league contracts before the season. They went out and got Tyson Miller. They got Jorge Lopez from the Mets recently. It's hard to read too much. I think it's actually very difficult to make trades early in the season. We've only seen a few that were not these like DFA waiver deals. Luis Arias was one, but the Marlins and Padres had reportedly been talking about that all through spring training, so I think they finally just got to a point where the deal worked for both sides. There just aren't a lot of guys on the market. One, right now, really all but I would consider the Cubs still technically in the wild card race. There are only 2 teams in the National League that are out of it and maybe 3 in the American League. So that's maybe 5, maybe 6 teams in all of baseball that don't consider themselves in the race on some level this year. So we just haven't hit the point in the season yet where a lot of those closers or solid middle late inning guys are going to be available by trade without a big overpay. And so I can argue going back to May, should the Cubs have? Maybe again, I don't even know who's theoretically available. You can say, well, go get a lot of talk about Mason Miller from the A's. Guy's got 4 years of team control left, and the A's still think he can be a starting pitcher. I don't think he can ever be a starting pitcher, but I think he can be an elite closer, although he is having his struggles at this point. But even the A's, who knows if they even would ever seriously make him available at that point in the season. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, we'll find out. But that's a very hard time to make the trade. So I think they were open to making moves. So that's where I kind of struggle with the part of your question that says lack of any serious movement. I think there weren't a lot of moves to make. And now we're getting to the point with the Cubs being, 11 and a half games behind the Brewers. I think there's 6 out of the, 5.5 out of the wild card, I think. Well, here, I've got it right in front of me. They're 5 out of the wild card. They're the lowest of the teams I would consider in contention, but they're behind Cincinnati, Washington, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, Arizona, New York, and St. Louis. And San Diego and Atlanta. So Atlanta, San Diego, and St. Louis are the 3 current wild cards. Everybody else is after that. You can make up 5 games, but you're also trailing that many teams. So we'll see. But the Cubs are definitely at a point right now where, kind of leading into Alex's question, should Jed wait to buy or sell? I think he should always be on the phone, should always be looking for opportunity. So that could be buy or sell. But in terms of making a wholesale decision that we are buyers or we are sellers, this is a year where I would wait. Now, last year I was frustrated because I think they had showed enough in June that the Cubs should have done more to be aggressive early to help make up a few extra wins early in July. So let's say you get we'll use a 6-win player because the season's 6 months old. So in theory, a 6-win player gets you an extra win every month. Not exactly how it exactly works out, but so if you wait till the day of the trade deadline, July 31st, August 1st, wherever that deadline sits, and you make that trade, you're getting that player. You can expect to get 2 wins out of that trade. If you trade for him at the end of June, you can expect to get 3. If you trade for him in middle of May, maybe you're getting 4.5. So it's all a matter of how much you're willing to pay, when you're willing to pay it. And at this point right now, if I'm the Cubs, I don't think I'm taking any significant prospect capital at this point and making a deal to add for this season without either 1, a significant turnaround, or 2, it's for a guy that is going to be under contract for more than just this season. At this point in the season, I'm not buying an expensive rental. Why? Why just give up that prospect capital? I mean, the Cubs may have to move some of it in the offseason just as they'll have another draft class. Guys will continue to rise up the system. And at some point, you either have to get value from trade or from that prospects play. But at this point, if they're not buying somebody who's under contract for next year and or beyond, I'm probably not making an addition trade right now. I'm also probably not waving the white flag at this point either. I mean, we're 5 games out, pretty, top 10 payroll in baseball. There's no serious money really that the Cubs would try to get under. I think what's frustrating fans right now is that I think Seiya Suzuki and Ian Happ are probably the 2 most obvious guys in Dansby. I think all 3 guys are pretty appropriately paid for what they are and what they produce. And Dansby's having a bad year this year, but I don't think this is the Dansby we're going to see for the rest of his career. So it's not like you have to get out of the Ian Happ money or have to get out of the Seiya money. And they both also have no trade clauses, so that factors in. But, what are they going to do? So maybe you make a trade with some of those guys. Most likely I would give this team certainly another 2 weeks to see what happens. I don't know that there's going to be some magic genie in a bottle that gets us turned around. But I do think the talent on this team is more than the sum of what they've played to this year. So there is that chance. Then you look beyond that. I mean, what should they do at the deadline? I could see Jed being a mixed buy and sell. I mean, there's rumor today that the Cubs have talked trade with the Mariners for Nico Horner. I don't know that that trade's going to happen. I don't know that that's any kind of... I can believe that they talked. It doesn't mean a trade is imminent. I think Nico Horner is a guy that could make sense to trade. He's a guy who's young, has team control left, is a productive player. Now, this year he's not having the greatest year, but he's been coming back lately, heating up. Fighting through the... He's been playing with a broken hand, and he played through the hamstring for a while. So he's had the injuries that I think have been part of the reason why he's not been as sharp. But he's a guy, it's not about trading Nico Horner. It's not that if I become truly pro trading Nico Horner, which right now I'm okay with it, I would not say I'm truly pro trading him. The benefit to trading him is that it opens up second base. And right now the Cubs are getting log jams in the outfield, and they have a log jam of guys kind of, first, second, third, not quite sure how you cover that with some of the guys coming up. And so if second is suddenly open, Michael Busch can switch over and play second base. Christopher Morel has been a better defensive second baseman than he's been a defensive third baseman from what I've seen in his career. In the minors, they've got Matt Shaw and James Triantos coming up. Matt Shaw can play second or third. He was a college shortstop. James Triantos can probably play second or third. Luis Vasquez is down in Iowa. He's hurt right now, so he's not an imminent call-up, but he's a guy who could go play a very good second base. He's an excellent defensive shortstop. It just gives you a chance to get some of these guys up. If you've got Nico and Dansby locked down for the next 2 years, the rest of this year plus 2 in the middle infield, it just limits the places where you can potentially use Morel, Shaw, Triantos, Vasquez. And so maybe it means some of those guys get packaged in trade, whatever. And the ability to potentially slide Michael Busch off first base opens up a spot for, if Cody Bellinger is not traded and he stays, that's a place where Cody can play if you're going to just put PCA in center field every day. Owen Casey has played some right, some DH. Pretty sure he's played some first base in the minor leagues. If you just want to get his bat up, that's maybe a place where his bat can go. So there are a lot of options. Ian Happ has played some first base in his career. At some point, he's a good enough athlete, a good enough defender. He's a former infielder, and maybe he makes a switch to first base. Like it just opens up more options. But even more importantly than that, as you head into the offseason, it opens up extra potential positions to go get that big bat. You could go get an elite second baseman. You could go get an elite third baseman. You could go get an elite power first baseman. You could probably go add another elite outfielder and potentially DH Seiya more often and play Bellinger at first base. I mean, it just opens up so many more options that I think at this point, Jed should be open to anything, buying and selling. Probably ideally do a mix of both. See what you can do to remake this team, give some space for some of the young players to come up and play, and maybe you catch some lightning in a bottle in the second half. Or at least, again, you might get more of an idea of what you have in the farm system as you head into the offseason. So the last question I have is kind of tied to the young player idea. Alex from Twitter asked, what's my take on who I would have as some of the untouchable prospects or promising prospects? So I'll start with the untouchable. I'm not a big believer in untouchables. I don't think anybody should ever be untouchable. I do think some players are going to be really, really expensive and probably prohibitively expensive. I think at this point, while he's still a prospect, again, like I said earlier, unless they're going to trade for some megastar right now, PCA is off the table. I mean, he's basically your starting center fielder right now, and you want to give him time to grow. If you're selling him in anything other than that kind of deal, you're selling him too low. There's been talk about Cade Horton. Now, Cade's been hurt. I'm not sure timeline for coming back. He's still a guy I'm very high on. I'm high on starting pitching. I think Jordan Wicks still actually carries prospect status. As we look to the minor league system, though, I mean, some of the guys that pop to me are Owen Casey and James Triantos and Matt Shaw, Jefferson Rojas, Kevin Alcantara, Moises Ballesteros. I'm really excited about Moises, a catcher, especially now that Miguel Amaya is really having his struggles and looking more and more like he's not going to pan out. I think he's looking more promising as a catcher. There was a time where I think the organization didn't, so I think he was going to stick at catcher. But it looks like that's improving, so I think he needs some more time in the minors to work on that, become good enough defensively to justify getting his bat up. He's only 20. It's crazy. Rojas is similar age. I think he's going to be a prospect that is leaping up the charts soon. Kevin Alcantara is probably potentially in line for a call-up next year. One of the issues they're going to have, though, in that outfield is they've got, with the guys they already have under contract, and it's happen say for the rest of this year plus 2. Cody Bellinger, if he continues to opt in, is the rest of this year plus 2. And you've got Owen Casey, Alexander Canario. Brennan Davis was having a good run before he got hurt again. We'll see if he is able to come back. Kevin Alcantara, if along with PCA, if you're going to get those guys up, that's too many guys more guys than are ever going to play in Chicago. So at that point you start having to be even guys you might not want to trade. Maybe you don't think Canario is going to be an everyday starter, so maybe he's a guy you trade for a reliever at some point. It may come down to, as much as the Cubs like both, it may come down to a Kevin Alcantara or Owen Casey situation at some point. I don't know. But I do believe in using prospect value to the fullest extent. And so at this point, if you want to use some low-level stuff to make some marginal upgrades on this bullpen and try to help them get through, that's fine. But if you're going to move major prospect capital on this team, I wouldn't do it right now. I'd probably wait till the offseason unless this team shows a good run. And I would like to try to sell from depth. The Cubs have good depth in pitching right now. They've got a number of good young starters and starter candidates in the majors. We just saw them do it, trading Jackson Ferris to the Dodgers. Jackson Wiggins is looking good in A-ball this year. There are other guys coming up through the system that I think are really promising. And the outfielders. The Cubs have a lot of young outfield candidates that could get dealt. So the more you can sell from depth, you're going to get value for those prospects and still leave yourself value in your pocket. And same with the infielders. The Cubs have a number of, what they do with Nico Horner will also start to dictate what happens with James Triantos and Luis Vasquez and Matt Shaw. Because if Horner stays and Michael Busch locks in at first base, if Christopher Morel doesn't lock in at third, there's really only one infield spot for those guys. And you're going to want to get value out of them in some way, shape, or form. So that would mean trading them. But I've had a great time with this episode. I want to thank everybody for the questions. We're running a little bit long, but let's keep doing this thing. The Cubs have big series this week against Philly, and then they play the Angels. We've been saying it. They just have to play better baseball. At this point, we're getting deep enough in the season. I'm not as confident saying I think they will. I do continue to say I don't think they can hit as a team this poorly. But they keep proving me wrong, so we'll see. But enjoy, keep watching baseball, find something fun. It's warm outside. Enjoy the summer. Have a great 4th, and we'll talk next week. Thank you for joining me today. If you like this episode, please drop a rating and review wherever it is you get your podcasts, and share an episode with a friend. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS+. And check out the patreon.com/CubsPS+ to help support the show. As always, the theme music for this podcast is Prospect Park West by Jerry McCoy. This is Mike Waller, host of the Cubs PS Plus podcast. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!